All right, this is a video that is being produced primarily for our members of the El Bethel Church of Christ in Shelbyville, though others will tune in and listen and download this video as well. This has primarily been being produced for our members at El Bethel. Due to the virus circumstance, we are not having Wednesday night Bible class or Sunday morning Bible class at the moment. We don't know how long that may last. So this is an effort to try to catch us up a little bit and give you an opportunity on Wednesday evenings and perhaps Sundays as well to uh, download this video or watch this video and catch up on chapters that we may be missing. This will be about a 20-minute video, and the reason for it being short is that our internet service here in my office and at the church building as well will not allow us to upload large amounts of data, so consequently we're going to have to keep this kind of brief. So this is an effort to keep up, and what I'm going to encourage you to do, we're going to be watching, mainly looking at PowerPoint slides as this presentation goes through. As we come to a chapter, we're going to cover a number of chapters. As we come to a chapter, I would encourage you to pause, read that chapter so that we don't spend time on the video reading that chapter. So let's get started here, and we are ready to give consideration to chapters 23 through 26. This date right here, the 18th, is the first Wednesday we missed, and the 25th is, of course, this Wednesday today, and so we are trying to catch up both of those so that we can keep up, that when we get ready to come back to our classes, we will be kind of caught up. So for this Wednesday, we're looking at Deuteronomy 23 to 26, so let's get underway. This is our outline we've been following in the adult class of this book. There are three major speeches, four if you count the last as a full speech, and we'll get to that when we get later on in our studies. But we are in this, according to Wiersbe, this is a 4-point outline he gives of the book of Deuteronomy, and we're in the practical concerns. Moses looks within, and chapter 26 is where we're going to end, and that's the end of the second sermon. So we're going to end the second sermon in our study today, and as Wiersbe outlines it, it deals with the judgments in 19 through 26. All right, I would encourage you to pause this video, stop it, and read chapter 23, and then we'll resume our study on the other side of you reading that. Okay, now that you've read Deuteronomy chapter 23, here's what chapter 23 deals with. It deals with purity of the congregation and the purity of the count. We have 5 things that are dealt with here. Those that are not allowed to enter the congregation, verses 1 to 8. We have the cleanliness and purity of the count. We have the runaway slave. We have the harlots and the sodomites are being excluded, and then we have the obligations of respect toward others. Let's start with verses 1 to 8 now, and here are those that are not allowed to enter the congregation. There are 4 that are mentioned here. Again, the focal point seems to be in chapter 23, the purity of the congregation and the purity of the count. And so you have in verse 1, one who has been castrated, who's been emasculated, as the New King James words it, either by crushing or mutilation, is not allowed to enter the congregation. The second one that is not allowed to enter the congregation is one of illegitimate birth. And verse 2 says that none of his descendants unto the 10th, even to the 10th generation. Now there's some question among commentators, does that unto the 10th generation, suggesting that by the 11th generation they could enter? Perhaps so, or some have suggested that may mean that it's forever. If you've kept this up to the 10th generation, then just continue that on. I'll leave that for you to decide. But for 10 generations, at least, the one of illegitimate birth is not allowed to enter. That's helping maintain the purity of the congregation and to discourage premarital or extramarital relationships. Beginning at verse 3, we have the Ammonite and the Moabite that are mentioned here for the 4th generation. The Ammonite and the Moabite shall not enter the congregation. And verse 4 tells us why, because of they did not meet you with bread. on the road that you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam. As you'll recall in the book of Numbers, Balaam was hired to try to curse the people. According to verse 4, even mentions that. Nevertheless, the Lord would not listen to Balaam and turned the curse into a blessing, because God loves you, and you shall not seek their peace or their prosperity all your days forever. Now, perhaps verse 6 is giving us some insight to what the 10th generation means, but again, I'll leave that for you to decide. Now, in verses 7 and 8, the Edomite and the Egyptian is somewhat different. What we mean by that is, you should not abhor the Edomite, for he's your brother, and you should not abhor the Egyptian, because you are an alien in his land, and the children of the third generation may enter the congregation. So they were not allowed to enter, the Edomite or the Egyptian, until the third generation, but at the third generation they would be allowed to enter. So verses 1 to 8, I know that's a quick summary, but that basically is a quick summary of what happens within the not allowing some to enter. Now let's talk about the cleanliness and the purity of the camp. In verses 9 to 14, here is keeping the camp itself clean, that when an army goes against your enemies, you're to keep yourself from every wicked thing. So in the matter of war, as you are going among the enemy, and there would be things that would be unclean, you're to keep yourself from that. If a man becomes unclean, according to verses 10 and 11, if he has an emission at night, he is to go outside the camp, and he can come back in after he washes himself, according to verse 11. So he would be unclean. He's to be kept outside the camp. Verses 12 to 14 deals with a place for a restroom, and that was to go outside the camp. They were to not do that within the camp, and each one was to take a spade or a shovel with him, and he was to cover his excrement or refuge when he has done that outside the camp. Now, the reason for that is the Lord God walks in your midst. There is respect for the camp and where God is, and for the place of purity and the place of holiness. So there's the cleanliness within the camp. Well, verses 15 and 16 talks about a runaway slave. This is perhaps a foreigner. Do not return him, verse 15, to his master, where that would be the case if it was one among your brethren. This seems to be a foreigner. And do not return him to his master. Don't take him back to the foreigner, but allow him to dwell where he chooses. That is, in your midst, he was allowed to do that. Now let's move on to the harlots and the sodomites were to be excluded. There would be no harlots, no ritual harlot of the daughters of Israel, or perverted ones of the sons of Israel. If you're reading from New King James, or one translation that has marginal notes or footnotes, you'll notice in the marginal note that the one who is the perverted one is one who is practicing sodomy or prostitution in religious rituals. But they are perverted. Now, I learned something very practical here, that those who practice sodomy or homosexuality are those who are perverted ones. And verse 18 says you're not to bring the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog, that perhaps a male prostitute, that's not to be brought to the house of the Lord. In other words, there was not to be a harlot among God's people. Then the money she gains to be brought to the Lord. The same thing with a male prostitute practicing sodomy. He's not to bring that into the house of the Lord. That would be an abomination. Now, here's obligation and respect toward others, verses 19 to 25. What we have here is you're not to charge interest from your brethren. You could from foreigners, but in verses 19 and 20, you shall not charge interest of your brother on anything or food or anything that is lent out at interest. But to the foreigner, you may do that according to verse 20. So you're not to charge interest. Verses 21 to 23, you pay what you have vowed. If you make a vow or make a promise, do not delay to pay it. The Lord God will require of it, and it'll be a sin. At verse 22, if you abstain from a vow, then you've not sinned. In other words, it's not wrong to not make the promise, but if you've made the promise, then you're to fulfill that. Well, that's a New Testament principle as well, James 5 And in verse 12, let your yea be yea and your nay nay. Your word should mean something. So whatever you've promised, that's what you should fulfill. It's not wrong to not make the promise, but it is wrong to make the promise and then not do what you promise. Now, verses 24 and 25, to finish that chapter, you eat only what you need from your neighbor's field. It would be proper and right to walk through your neighbor's vineyard and his in his fields, in his standing grain, and eat what you needed to satisfy your hunger. But you're not to gather that as a crop, and that is, you're not to harvest that. So eat only what you need from your neighbor's field. So that's the purity of the congregation and the count. Now, let's pause again and read chapter 24. And then on the other side of you reading that, we'll resume our study of chapter 24. All right, chapter 24 now. We're going to spend a little time here and then kind of pick up our pace perhaps on chapters 25 and 26. But chapter 24, verses 1 to 4 is where we want to spend most of our time because it's a misunderstood text, and it deals with the matter of divorce. This is what's quoted or referred to when Jesus has a discussion with the Pharisees in Matthew 19. He's talking about this principle of the Pharisees are referring back to Deuteronomy 24 when they ask, why did Moses give the command to give the writing of divorcement? We'll come to Matthew 19 a little bit later. But you've already read the text, so let's see what it says here. The text is an if-then kind of construction of the text. The text is saying in verses 1 to 3, if a man puts away his wife for uncleanness, we'll define that in a moment, and if she becomes another man's wife, and if then the second man puts her away or dies, then she may not remarry her first husband. This seems to be designed to eliminate and discourage a frivolous divorce. So think about it before you divorce your mate, because if you put her away and she goes and becomes another man's wife, and then he puts her away or he dies, you can't have her back. She can't come back to her first husband. Now, this has been a greatly misunderstood text, and perhaps some of that is because of the King James rendering of that. That's what you see on your screen, is the King James rendering of that. And what I want you to notice is at verse 3 and 4. And if the latter husband dies, her former husband which sent her away may not take her back. Nothing wrong with the translation. But what I'm suggesting to you is look at the New American Standard, and I've highlighted, or at least put in a different color here, the words if and then. Notice the if-then construction. You have the word if at verse 3, and if the latter husband turn against her, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again. Well, let's see the same thing in the New King James. Verse 3, if the latter husband detest her, etc., then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife. Well, here's the principle. There's nothing in Deuteronomy 24 to encourage divorce and remarriage. The Pharisees in Matthew 19, when referring back to this text, said, why did Moses command? That was their word, not found in Deuteronomy 24. There is nothing in the text to encourage divorce and remarriage. This is a very important point right here. This is a simple prohibition. The put-away woman cannot remarry her first husband. This is casuistic or contingency law. Notice again the if and then construction that we've noticed. That if what? Man puts away his wife for uncleanness, and if she becomes another man's wife, and if the second man puts her away or dies, then she may not remarry her first husband. That's all this text says. Now let's talk about the uncleanness. Some have suggested that the uncleanness is her adultery. He puts her away for adultery. And so what is that? Well, I want to suggest to you, first of all, it matters little what uncleanness is here. And you say, why does it not matter? It doesn't matter because we don't live under that law. And so I really am not greatly concerned about what the uncleanness is, because whatever it may be. I don't live under that law, so I'm not trying to consider a case, did this fit Deuteronomy 24? I don't see any case today where I have to try to figure out whether Deuteronomy 24 fits that. But let's go a little further to suggest it's not adultery, because she would be stoned for that. We saw that in 2 chapters earlier, Deuteronomy 22. It's not suspicion for adultery, because Numbers 5 dealt with that. It's not evidence she was not a virgin, because Deuteronomy 22 dealt with that. So what is it? It's perhaps some flaw that he finds in her. In Genesis 49, I meant to go back and check the reference on that. Maybe chapter 42. I'll leave you to check 49 or 42. But anyway, verse 9 and 12, it was used, that same word is used with reference to a flaw in the land. So perhaps that's talking about he finds some flaw in her. Not that he found adultery in her, but something he doesn't like, and he puts her away. The whole point is, whatever reason he puts her away, she cannot come back to her first husband. Now, I want to suggest to you that Jesus said in Matthew 19, Moses suffered or allowed. Now, there's a difference, and here's what I want you to see. Did Moses command? Well, the answer to that is no. Did he allow it with approval? No. Did God, through Moses, allow it in the sense he tolerated divorce? And the answer is yes. That's the sense in which Jesus is saying that God suffered, or Moses suffered you to put away your mate. God tolerated that. Now, in interest of time, because I'm trying to keep this video short, and we're already running longer than I meant to, and we're in just chapter 24, verses 5 to 22 deals with miscellaneous laws. And so what I want to do right here is just kind of categorize these as you have see them on your screen. What were some miscellaneous laws? Well, a newly married man was exempt from war duty for a year. You couldn't take a millstone as a pledge. That's part of their livelihood or how they would eat. So you can't take his livelihood away from him or his ability to eat away from him. A kidnapper was to be stoned to death or to be killed. You should carefully obey laws with reference to leprosy. This is found in chapter 24, verses 8 and 9. Notice at verse 8, take heed in an outbreak of leprosy that you diligently, and some New King James uses the word carefully, observe to do according to all that the priest commands you. Then there's a reminder of what the Lord did to Miriam when he became angry. That's found at verse 9. Well, that was in Numbers chapter 12 because of her rebellion against Moses. Now, in verses 10 to 15, here is a group of things dealing with the poor. You're not to enter a poor man's house to get a pledge. The pledge is to be returned at the end of the day, so perhaps his garment or his coat is to be returned back to him. Don't keep that when he may need that. Don't oppress the poor and pay them their wages. Don't hold that back from them. Now, verse 16 talks about parents are not to be punished for the children and children for the parents. Each one bears their own responsibility. Reminds us of Ezekiel 18. Verses 17 and 18 says, do not oppress the weak. And then 19 to 22, leave some harvest for the poor. When you harvest your fields and your vineyards, leave a little bit that the others may have something to harvest, particularly those who are poor. Now let's pause again. Our time is about gone, but let's pause and read chapter 25. All right, chapter 25 now. This deals with miscellaneous laws, and they focus primarily on fairness. Now, what do we have here? Well, we're going to see the punishment of the wicked. They are to be beaten, and that is, if there comes two men who are in a dispute and they come to the court, the one who is wicked is to be beaten, and the judges could give him a certain number of blows depending upon how severe his crime may be. But 40 was the limit. 40 stripes were the limit. Lest they go beyond that and violate the law, the Jews generally gave 39. 2 Corinthians 11:24 gives us some insight to that. They were not to give him more lest he be humiliated or are degraded in the presence of his people. Now, at verse 4, you shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. And that is, the point is that man and animal, both, that the labor is worthy of the hire. This is quoted in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 9 in talking about support of preaching the gospel. It's cited in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and 18 in support of those who are serving as elders. Full-time elders could be paid for the work that they do. And so it's a general principle of the laborer being worthy of his hire. Now we have the responsibility to a brother's widow. We see a question about this in Matthew chapter 22, beginning at verse 23. The point of this is that if a man dies and he doesn't have children, that his brother was to take his wife and bear children by her, so that the family name and the family inheritance would not be lost. That seems to be the point. Now, here is the abuse by a woman during fighting. Two men are fighting, and if a woman comes and grabs him by his private parts, then her hand was to be cut off. This is the only punishment that I remember or finding here that involves mutilation, that was her hand was to be cut off. And perhaps that's because she's endangering his ability for his family to continue. Then there is integrity in business. In other words, fair scales and fair balance. And in other words, don't put your thumb on the scale and or don't use a false balance so that you're cheating others. There's honesty and integrity in business transaction. And then to end that chapter, there's the destruction of the Amalekites. And that is, remember Amalek and what he did to you when you were coming out of Egypt. The record of this is found in Exodus 17. And that he attacked you from the rear. And you remember that. He's telling them at verse 18 and 19, and you're to blot out the Amalekites. Well, that was fulfilled finally in 1 Samuel 15 under Saul. But these are just miscellaneous laws concerning fairness. Now let's go to chapter 26. Let's pause, take time to read chapter 26, and then on the other side of your reading, we'll resume. All right, let's finish up. We're only 2 minutes past our goal of trying to keep this to 20 minutes, so let's see what we can do with chapter 26. I call this simply ceremonial obligations. In chapter 26, there are 3 themes. There's the offering of the first fruits, verses 1 through 11. And so here's the first fruits that are to be offered. One question may come as you're reading, that is at verse 5, that my father was a Syrian about to perish when he went down to Egypt. Well, Jacob fled to Syria from Esau is what he's talking about there in that text. Now, Kaufman in his commentary divides these 3 sections in this regard. That in verses 1 through 11, there seems to be an acknowledgement on the part of the worshiper that God has fulfilled his promise. When you come into the land, verse 1 of chapter 26. So when you come into the land, then here is this offering of the first fruits as an acknowledgement God did what he said he would do. Now, verses 12 to 15, there's the offering of the 3rd year tithe. Kaufman observes that this is an affirmation on the part of the worshiper that he too has kept his promise. That is, God kept his promise, and I've kept my promise. Now, we get to 16 to 19, and I call this simply closing remarks, or Kaufman calls this the ratification of this covenant between man and his God. But what a way to end this. This is the same note on which the first sermon ended. Now, this is the ending of the second sermon. That you should be careful, verse 16, to observe them, that is, the judgments and the statutes and the commandments, that you observe them with all your heart and with all your soul. So this sermon ends on the very note that chapter 4 ended the first sermon, and that is, there is careful obedience with all of your heart to the law of God. Now, I know that's a hurried look. I'm just trying to catch us up on these chapters. I'm trying to catch us up from Deuteronomy 23 to 26. And so we're going to end this here. And if we continue to have to be out Wednesday nights, then we'll do another one for next week. Sunday, we'll try to have a video for our studies in John, catch us up and get us to where we will be in gear when we come back together in our full Bible classes and our full assemblies. All right. Thank you for listening, and watch for our members. Watch for our one call probably on Saturday, giving more information about what our plans are.